Some names do not simply belong to a person. They become symbols, expectations, and burdens carried long after childhood ends. In the world of NASCAR, few names carry more weight than Earnhardt. It is a name forged in speed, fear, and dominance, a name that once commanded silence the moment it appeared on the track. But behind the roar of engines and the mythology of victory, there exists a quieter story, one shaped not by trophies or championships, but by absence, restraint, and a silence that stretched across an entire lifetime. For years, people asked a simple question: what did your father teach you about racing, about life, about winning? The answer was never what they expected. There were no long conversations, no shared strategies, no father and son moments spent dissecting laps or lines. In fact, they rarely talked about racing at all. Across more than 100 professional races, the man everyone feared never once sat in the stands to watch his son compete. Not because he did not care, but because care, in his world, was never expressed through presence or praise. It was expressed through pressure. That son was Dale Earnhardt Jr., born into a legacy that burned hotter than the engines that surrounded him. From the moment he entered the world, his life was defined by a last name that meant everything to everyone else and very little in the spaces where it mattered most. Fame followed him before he could walk. Expectations followed him before he could speak. And somewhere between the noise of the track and the quiet of home, he learned that love was something to be earned, not given. At the center of that silence stood Dale Earnhardt, a man revered as one of the most intimidating figures the sport had ever known. On the asphalt, he was relentless, aggressive, and unyielding. Fans admired him. Rivals feared him. Victory bent in his direction more often than not. But at home, he was a different presence entirely. Reserved, distant, a man who believed vulnerability was a weakness and affection a distraction. He ruled by example, not explanation, and expected his son to learn the same way he had survived. Alone. Growing up under that roof meant learning to live with unspoken rules. Feelings were rarely acknowledged. Praise was scarce. Mistakes were lessons, not comforted failures. Every achievement was met not with celebration, but with the quiet understanding that the standard would rise again tomorrow. In that environment, a young boy learned that approval came only through performance. To win was to be seen. To lose was to disappear back into the background of expectation. The absence was not loud. It did not announce itself. It simply existed day after day, shaping a childhood that looked privileged from the outside but felt hollow from within. While other children spoke of encouragement and guidance, Dale Jr. learned to read between silences. A nod meant approval. A glance meant recognition. And silence meant he had not done enough yet. That emotional distance did not crush him outright. Instead, it hardened him, teaching resilience at the cost of tenderness. As the family fractured through divorce and remarriage, the sense of warmth faded even further. Home became less a place of comfort and more a controlled environment where image mattered as much as achievement. The Earnhardt name was no longer just a family identity. It was a brand carefully managed and fiercely protected. In that world, personal needs were secondary to legacy. Conversations were measured, emotions were filtered, and the child at the center of it all learned to survive by adapting, not by asking. For Dale Jr., the track became both refuge and battlefield. It was the one place where he felt closest to his father and the one place where he was judged most harshly. Every lap carried more than the risk of crashing. It carried the weight of expectation and the hope, however faint, of acknowledgement. Racing was not just a career. It was a language. The only one his father truly spoke. This is where the story begins, not with scandal or conflict, but with a silence that shaped everything that followed. A silence that taught a boy how to endure. A silence that would later explode into grief, loss, and a fight for identity that no one saw coming. I will stop here. Do you want me to continue? Long before the public ever saw him lift a trophy or stand beneath the bright lights of Victory Lane, Dale Jr. was learning how to live inside a contradiction. His childhood unfolded in a world where speed was normal, danger was routine, and expectation was ever present. Yet emotional closeness was strangely absent. He grew up surrounded by people, mechanics, sponsors, media voices, but intimacy was rare. The house was full, yet often felt quiet in a way that was difficult to name. From an early age, his days were shaped by structure and discipline rather than play. Racing schedules dictated family rhythms. Training replaced leisure. Failure was not something to be discussed, only corrected. There was little room for softness and even less for vulnerability. While the outside world imagined a golden upbringing, what existed instead was a constant awareness that he was being prepared for something enormous, something that did not allow for weakness. Childhood was less a season of discovery and more a proving ground. The relationship with his father was defined by observation rather than conversation. Dale Jr. learned by watching from a distance, absorbing habits and behaviors without explanation. There were no long talks about fear or doubt. Those emotions were understood to be private burdens. If they existed, they were to be handled alone. His father did not ask how he felt after a race. He watched how he drove. He watched whether he endured. And in that gaze, Dale Jr. learned that performance was the only reliable form of communication. The emotional tone of the household hardened further after the family fractured. Divorce introduced instability, but not in the way the public might imagine. There were no explosive scenes, no dramatic confrontations. Instead, there was a gradual cooling, a shift toward formality. When his father remarried, the home took on a new order. With the arrival of Teresa Earnhardt, the Earnhardt name began to function less like a family bond and more like a carefully managed enterprise. She brought discipline, control, and an unyielding focus on legacy. Every decision seemed calculated. Every interaction carried an invisible boundary. She did not present herself as cruel, but neither did she offer warmth. For a young boy still searching for reassurance, the message was subtle but clear. There were roles to play, expectations to meet, and standards that could not be questioned. Emotional needs were secondary to the preservation of something larger than any individual. Within that environment, Dale Jr. adapted rather than resisted. He learned to be self-sufficient early. He stopped expecting affirmation and started measuring himself by outcomes. His sister became a quiet ally, someone who understood the unspoken rules and the cost of breaking them. Together, they navigated a world where love was implied rather than expressed, and where silence often carried more meaning than words ever could. Racing, meanwhile, intensified. What began as an inherited path slowly became a necessity. The track was the only place where the rules were clear. You were either fast enough or you were not. You either won or you learned. There was no ambiguity, no emotional guessing. For Dale Jr., this clarity was comforting. It allowed him to focus, to channel everything he could not say into something he could control. Every lap became an argument for his worth. Yet even as his skills sharpened and his confidence grew, the internal conflict deepened. Success did not bring relief. It brought more expectation. Each victory raised the bar higher, pushing him further into a role he had never consciously chosen but could not escape. He was not simply racing for himself. He was racing to justify his place in a lineage that did not forgive mediocrity. Public perception added another layer of pressure. Fans saw a young man blessed with opportunity. Critics whispered about nepotism. Commentators compared him relentlessly to his father, measuring him against a standard that had already achieved legendary status. There was little space to simply become. Every step forward was framed as either living up to the name or falling short of it. Privately, the cost accumulated. Moments that should have been joyful felt transactional. Praise, when it came, felt conditional. There was pride, but it was quiet and restrained. There was disappointment, but it was heavy and unspoken. Over time, Dale Jr. learned to suppress his own emotional responses, convincing himself that endurance was the same as strength. He believed that if he could just push harder, drive faster, and win more consistently, the silence might eventually break. But silence has a way of shaping people long before they understand its impact. By the time Dale Jr. reached adulthood, he had already internalized a belief that connection must be earned and that approval was never permanent. These lessons did not come from cruelty. They came from a culture that valued toughness above all else, a culture that had produced champions but rarely nurtured closeness. This background, built on discipline, distance, and relentless expectation, set the stage for everything that would follow. It explains why grief would later feel so isolating, why conflict would cut so deeply, and why the fight for identity would become inevitable. Nothing that happened later emerged out of nowhere. It was all rooted here in the quiet years where a boy learned how to survive inside a legacy that gave him everything except peace. The past and the present finally collided on a day that no one inside the Earnhardt world will ever forget. February 18th, 2001 began like any other race day, filled with routine, anticipation, and the familiar tension that lived permanently in the garage. The Daytona 500 was more than a season opener. It was a ritual, a proving ground, a place where legends either reaffirmed themselves or fell apart. For the Earnhardt family, it was supposed to be another chapter in a long and storied history. Instead, it became the moment that fractured everything. As the final laps unfolded, something subtle yet profound was happening on the track. Dale Earnhardt was no longer racing for himself. He stayed back, blocking the field with calculated aggression, placing his car between danger and the two drivers ahead of him, one of them his own son. It was a move born of instinct and sacrifice, an act that spoke louder than any conversation they had never had. In that instant, protection replaced ambition. Love replaced victory. And then, in a split second, the noise stopped. The crash was violent, sudden, and final. The sport froze. Fans watched in disbelief as the man who had seemed untouchable was gone. For the world of NASCAR, it was a collective shock. For Dale Earnhardt Jr., it was a rupture so deep it altered the structure of his identity. He did not just lose a father. He lost the only bridge he had ever known to approval, recognition, and belonging. Grief in the Earnhardt family did not arrive loudly. There were no public breakdowns, no emotional confessions broadcast for the world to consume. Instead, grief arrived as silence, heavier and more suffocating than before. In the days following the tragedy, the absence of Dale Sr. was felt not only emotionally, but operationally. Power shifted, control consolidated, and the family dynamic changed overnight. Teresa Earnhardt stepped forward as the steward of everything her husband had built. To the public, she appeared strong, composed, and unwavering. She spoke the language of continuity and protection. She positioned herself as the guardian of a legacy that could not be allowed to fracture. But behind closed doors, that guardianship took on a sharper edge. Decisions were centralized, boundaries hardened, and the distance between Dale Jr. and the empire bearing his own name began to widen. At first, the tension was subtle. It showed itself in meetings where his voice carried less weight, in conversations that ended without resolution, in contracts delayed, payments questioned, and authority quietly stripped away. Dale Jr. was no longer just a son grieving his father. He was an asset within a corporate structure, subject to oversight and approval. The company, Dale Earnhardt Incorporated, no longer felt like an extension of family. It felt like a machine that could function without him. Racing became his refuge again, but now it carried a different burden. Every lap was soaked in memory. Every win was haunted by absence. He drove harder, pushed deeper, and buried his pain beneath performance. From the outside, he appeared resilient. From the inside, he was unraveling. The man he had spent his life trying to impress was gone, and with him, the possibility of reconciliation, of hearing words that would never be spoken. The conflicts intensified as time passed. Dale Jr. wanted more than a symbolic role in his father's company. He wanted ownership, equity, a voice in the future of the organization that bore his bloodline. What he encountered instead was resistance. Teresa held tightly to control, framing her decisions as necessary to protect the brand. For Dale Jr., those decisions felt like exclusion. The name on the building was his. The history belonged to his family. Yet he found himself locked out of the very structure his father had envisioned passing down. The breaking point arrived not as a dramatic explosion, but as a slow realization that his place within DEI was shrinking. When paychecks were delayed and questions went unanswered, frustration boiled over. Confrontations followed, heated and unresolved. Trust eroded. The relationship moved beyond strain into open fracture. By the time Dale Jr. made the decision to leave in 2008, the separation was inevitable. What stunned fans was not that he left, but how he left. Teresa refused to allow him to take the number 8 car with him. To outsiders, it seemed trivial. To those who understood racing, it was devastating. That number was his identity, forged through years of struggle, success, and connection to his father. Denying him that symbol was not a business move alone. It was a message. The legacy would remain under her control, even if it meant severing emotional ties completely. But the conflict did not end there. Years later, when Dale Jr. sought to trademark his own last name for future ventures, he was met with formal opposition. His stepmother challenged his right to use the name he was born with, arguing that it could create confusion in the marketplace. The dispute moved into the legal realm, stripping the conflict of any remaining pretense of family. It was no longer about racing. It was about identity. For Dale Jr., this was the deepest cut. He had spent his life earning the right to carry that name on the track. Now he was being told that, legally and symbolically, it did not belong to him. Public reaction was swift and emotional. Fans who had once admired Teresa's strength now questioned her motives. Silence, once interpreted as dignity, began to feel cold. Throughout it all, Dale Jr. did not lash out. He did not attack publicly. Instead, he spoke slowly and carefully, revealing pieces of the truth through interviews, podcasts, and reflections. He described the pain of being sidelined, the loneliness of walking away from his father's legacy, and the exhaustion of fighting battles he never wanted. His restraint gave his words weight. The absence of counter-statements amplified their impact. This chapter marked the moment when grief transformed into confrontation, when legacy became a battlefield rather than a bond. Everything that followed would be shaped by these events, by the realization that silence had cost him more than he ever understood. And once broken, it could never be restored to what it once was. The consequences of that fracture did not arrive all at once. They unfolded slowly, settling into every corner of Dale Jr.'s life in ways that were not always visible to the public. On the surface, his career continued. He raced. He won. He stood before cameras and answered questions with practice calm. But beneath the familiar routines, something fundamental had shifted. The world he once believed he belonged to no longer felt accessible, and the cost of that realization began to surface in quiet, persistent ways. Emotionally, the aftermath was heavy and disorienting. The loss of his father had already left a void that could never be filled. The breakdown of his relationship with the organization carrying the Earnhardt name deepened that sense of isolation. Dale Jr. found himself grieving not only a person, but an entire future he had once assumed was his. The idea that he would one day inherit a meaningful role in his father's legacy faded, replaced by the stark reality that legacy could be withheld, controlled, and redefined without him. Psychologically, the pressure intensified. For years, racing had been his coping mechanism, the one place where effort translated into clarity. Now, even that refuge felt compromised. Victories brought applause, but they no longer brought peace. Losses felt heavier, magnified by the sense that he was racing not just opponents, but ghosts. The expectations never diminished, yet the emotional rewards that once sustained him were gone. Publicly, the narrative began to fracture as well. Fans were divided between loyalty to tradition and sympathy for a son pushed to the margins. Media coverage shifted from celebrating lineage to questioning leadership. Commentators who once spoke reverently about unity now openly debated whether the Earnhardt legacy was being honored or suffocated. The silence from Teresa, once interpreted as professionalism, increasingly appeared detached. Each unanswered question added to the perception of a family permanently broken. Professionally, Dale Jr.'s departure from DEI forced him to rebuild from a place of emotional exhaustion. Leaving behind familiar colors, symbols, and infrastructure meant more than a contractual change. It meant redefining himself outside the shadow of his father's empire. That process was not immediate. It required recalibration, humility, and a willingness to accept uncertainty. For someone who had spent his life measured against a fixed standard, the absence of that framework was both liberating and terrifying. The legal disputes cast a long shadow over this period. The challenge to his right to use his own name became a symbol of how far the conflict had gone. It signaled to the world that the rupture was not temporary or negotiable. Identity itself had become contested ground. For Dale Jr., this carried a profound emotional toll. The name he had once struggled to live up to was now something he had a fight to claim. The impact extended beyond him. His sister, longtime allies, and even former teammates were drawn into the tension, forced to navigate loyalties carefully. Relationships became cautious. Conversations carried weight. The sense of family that once surrounded the Earnhardt operation dissipated, replaced by formality and distance. What had been a collective endeavor fractured into separate paths, each shaped by unresolved grief and unresolved power. Over time, the strain began to manifest physically. Dale Jr. has spoken openly about periods of anxiety, burnout, and the cumulative toll of carrying unprocessed loss. The relentless pace of racing, combined with emotional suppression, created a vulnerability he could no longer ignore. The culture that had taught him endurance had not taught him recovery. Acknowledging that limitation became an unexpected turning point. Yet within these consequences, there was also transformation. Forced to step away from a structure that had defined him, Dale Jr. slowly began to construct something new. He built ventures that reflected his values rather than his surname. He found ways to speak about his experiences on his own terms, without accusation or spectacle. In doing so, he reclaimed agency that had long been deferred. The broader racing community also felt the ripple effects. Fans began to reconsider what legacy truly meant. Was it ownership and control, or was it connection and continuity? The Earnhardt story shifted from a tale of dominance to a cautionary narrative about what happens when preservation eclipses compassion. Discussions once confined to legal filings and boardrooms entered public discourse, reshaping how the sport viewed power and inheritance. Ultimately, the consequences of this conflict reshaped every dimension of Dale Jr.'s life. They altered his relationship with racing, with family, and with himself. What he lost was immense, but what emerged was a deeper understanding of the cost of silence and the danger of unresolved grief. These consequences did not close the story. They set the stage for reflection, resilience, and the slow redefinition of what it meant to carry the Earnhardt name forward. Away from court filings, contracts, and press conferences, there were quieter moments that revealed the depth of what had been lost. These were not moments designed for cameras or public sympathy. They were fragments of memory, small denials, and closed doors that carried more emotional weight than any headline ever could. Dale Jr. would later describe these moments not with anger, but with a sense of disbelief, as if he were still trying to understand how distance had replaced what once should have been closeness. One of the most painful examples involved land, not money or branding, but a simple piece of ground. After his father's death, Dale Jr. hoped to purchase a section of the wooded property his father had once owned, a place that held personal meaning rather than commercial value. It was land tied to quiet memories, to the idea of building a home near the space where his father had once found peace away from the track. When he asked, the answer was brief and final. No explanation, no negotiation, just refusal. Respecting that decision, he walked away and built his life elsewhere, but the rejection lingered. It was not about the land itself. It was about being denied even a symbolic connection. There were other exclusions that cut even deeper. The Deer Head Shop, a private space filled with personal artifacts from his father's life, remained locked. Inside were race suits, trophies, handwritten notes, and items from Dale Jr.'s own childhood. It was, in many ways, a physical archive of family history. Since the day his father died, Dale Jr. has never been allowed inside. The doors were closed, and time passed without access. Years turned into decades. The space became untouchable, preserved in silence, as if memory itself had been placed under guard. These were not decisions announced publicly. They were never debated on television. Yet they shaped Dale Jr.'s understanding of his place within the family narrative. He was not just excluded from business decisions. He was excluded from memory. The past, once shared, had become something he was no longer permitted to touch. Friends and colleagues noticed the weight he carried, even when he rarely spoke about it. Those close to him described a man who rarely complained, but who often paused before answering questions about his father. There was hesitation in those pauses, a careful choosing of words that suggested unresolved grief. He did not frame his experiences as betrayals. He framed them as facts. This happened. That door stayed closed. This conversation never came. In private, he struggled with the emotional contradiction of honoring a legacy he no longer had access to. He loved his father deeply. He respected what he had built, but he was forced to reconcile that love with the reality that the legacy had been sealed away from him. That tension followed him everywhere. It surfaced in quiet moments, long after the engine stopped, when there was nothing left to distract him from memory. The stories that emerged later, through conversations and reflections, carried a consistent theme. Dale Jr. never wanted control for its own sake. He wanted acknowledgement. He wanted to feel included in the continuation of something his father had intended to pass down. Instead, he was left navigating a version of legacy that existed around him but not with him. What made these moments especially heavy was the absence of explanation. Silence filled the gaps where conversation might have offered closure. Over time, that silence became its own answer. It communicated boundaries more clearly than any argument ever could. For Dale Jr., this meant learning to grieve not just what was lost, but what was never allowed to exist. Yet within these quiet wounds, something else began to form. Distance forced introspection. Exclusion forced independence. Slowly, Dale Jr. began to understand that while he could not control what was withheld from him, he could control how he carried himself forward. He started to speak more openly about emotional health, about the long-term impact of suppressed grief. He allowed vulnerability into spaces where toughness had once been mandatory. These untold stories mattered because they revealed the human cost beneath the legal and corporate conflicts. They showed that the deepest pain did not come from losing a position or a number on a car. It came from being denied access to memory, to history, to a sense of belonging that should never have required permission. In sharing these moments, Dale Jr. was not seeking sympathy. He was giving shape to experiences that had lived quietly for years. And in doing so, he reclaimed something that had been slowly taken from him. His voice, his perspective, his truth. With time, distance, and reflection, the meaning of the Earnhardt story began to change for Dale Jr. What once felt like an endless struggle against expectation and exclusion slowly transformed into something more complex and, in some ways, more honest. Legacy was no longer defined solely by inheritance, ownership, or control. It became something internal, shaped by choice rather than permission. The achievements of his career were undeniable. Championships, victories, and respect within the sport had already secured his place in racing history. Yet when viewed through the lens of his personal journey, those accomplishments carried a different weight. They were not just wins on a track. They were proof of endurance, proof that success could exist alongside unresolved pain. For years, Dale Jr. had chased recognition through performance. Now, he began to understand that recognition did not have to come from the same source that had withheld it for so long. The absence of his father remained permanent, but it softened with understanding. Dale Jr. came to see that his father's emotional distance was not rooted in indifference, but in limitation. The man who dominated racetracks had never been taught how to navigate vulnerability. His love was expressed through protection, sacrifice, and expectation, not conversation. This realization did not erase the pain, but it reframed it. It allowed grief to coexist with compassion. The role of Teresa remained unresolved and largely silent, yet its significance shifted as well. Over time, the focus moved away from blame and toward consequence. Her decisions preserved a brand, but they fractured a family. That truth stood on its own, requiring no further argument. Dale Jr. did not need vindication through confrontation. The public, the fans, and history would form their own conclusions. What mattered more was his ability to step out of that conflict without carrying it forward as bitterness. In stepping away from the structures that once defined him, Dale Jr. discovered a quieter form of legacy. It emerged in mentorship, in storytelling, in openness about mental health and emotional resilience. By speaking honestly about anxiety, grief, and burnout, he challenged the culture of toughness that had shaped his upbringing. He demonstrated that strength did not require silence, and that endurance, without healing, came at a cost. The contrast between public triumph and private struggle became central to his story. Fame had amplified every success, but had also magnified every wound. Through reflection, Dale Jr. recognized that the true danger of legacy was not loss, but repetition. Without awareness, the same patterns that had shaped him could be passed down unchanged. Breaking that cycle became an act of intention. Legacy, then, was no longer something inherited automatically. It was something built deliberately. It lived in how he treated others, how he spoke about the past, and how he allowed space for vulnerability where it had once been denied. The roar of engines no longer drowned out the quieter lessons. They emerged slowly, shaped by years of silence and the courage to finally speak. The Earnhardt name would always be tied to dominance and speed, but through Dale Jr., it also became associated with reflection and humanity. His story expanded the definition of what it meant to carry a famous name. It showed that honor did not come from control alone, but from empathy and growth. That a legacy protected too tightly could become a prison, while one allowed to evolve could become a bridge. In the end, the greatest inheritance Dale Jr. claimed was not a company, a number, or a trademark. It was perspective, the understanding that pain, when acknowledged, could become wisdom, that loss, when faced, could reshape purpose, and that the most enduring legacy was not found in what was left behind, but in what was transformed along the way. In the quiet aftermath of everything that had unfolded, what remained was not anger, but clarity. The long road Dale Jr. had traveled was marked by loss, silence, and struggle, yet also revealed something unexpected. When everything that once defined him was stripped away, what surfaced was a man who no longer needed permission to belong. He had spent much of his life chasing approval from places that could never fully give it. By the end of that journey, he understood that approval was not the same as peace. The Earnhardt name would forever echo through the sport, etched into record books and collective memory. It would always be associated with dominance, fearlessness, and victory. But through Dale Earnhardt Jr., that name gained another dimension. It became a story not just of what was won, but of what was endured, not just of legacy inherited, but of identity reclaimed. He did not emerge from the conflict triumphant in the traditional sense. There was no dramatic reconciliation, no final courtroom victory that restored what had been taken. Some doors remained closed. Some questions were never answered. Yet there was strength in accepting that not every story resolves cleanly. Closure, he learned, does not always come from others. Sometimes it comes from deciding to stop waiting. By choosing to speak openly, Dale Jr. reshaped the meaning of silence in his life. What once suffocated him became something he could finally step beyond. His voice, steady and unembellished, carried weight precisely because it avoided spectacle. He did not rewrite history. He simply told it. And in doing so, he allowed others to see that even icons are shaped by unseen battles. For fans, the story carried its own reckoning. It challenged the romantic notion that legacy guarantees unity, that success naturally passes from one generation to the next without cost. It exposed the fragile line between preservation and possession, between honoring the past and controlling it. Many who once viewed the Earnhardt empire as untouchable began to see it as human, flawed, and vulnerable to the same fractures that affect any family. What Dale Jr. ultimately modeled was a different kind of strength. Not the strength to dominate, but the strength to step away. Not the power to control, but the courage to redefine. He built a future that reflected who he had become, not who he was expected to be. In that choice, he honored his father in a way that racing alone never could. He refused to let pain calcify into resentment. He refused to let silence define the rest of his life. The story does not end with victory or defeat. It ends with understanding that legacies are living things, shaped as much by what is withheld as by what is given. That families, even famous ones, are not immune to miscommunication and grief. And that identity, once questioned, can be rebuilt on firmer ground. Dale Jr. did not lose everything. He lost illusions. He lost access. He lost certainty. But he gained perspective, empathy, and a voice strong enough to carry both pride and sorrow without contradiction. The road he traveled was not the one he was promised, but became the one that revealed who he truly was. And perhaps that is the most enduring legacy of all. Not the empire left behind, but the person who learned how to walk forward without it. If you had carried that name, endured that silence, and faced those choices, would you have found the strength to speak when it finally mattered most?